lecture in this academic year, although this month it should be the fourth, but we've had to cancel or postpone the first three lectures. The situation in Lebanon is known to all of you. Some have wondered why we are discussing Mormons in the Lebanon of today when we have such grave problems and deep crises around us. Are we at Nest living on another planet? Of course, we are just as concerned, and some of us just as involved as other Lebanese are in the current crisis that the country is going through. But that does not mean that we stop everything else that we do or suppress every other interest or desire for knowledge and growth in learning. Part of dealing with the crisis is not to let it totally overwhelm you and reduce you to facing it only. Yes, in a sense, we do live on another planet. It can't be otherwise in an institution of learning. We have to live on the planet of seeking knowledge and deepening ourselves in what is not only immediately around us. And so it is in this spirit that we gather today to listen to Dr. Donna Ray, to her presentation about Christianity on the Margins, the Case of Mormons. Donna Ray is an American academician who has done graduate studies in Northwestern University, Illinois, Princeton Theological Seminary, and Yale Divinity School, and then received her doctoral degree from the Department of History in the University of New Mexico in 2011. Her doctoral dissertation was entitled, "There is a Threeness About You, Trinitarian Images of God, Self, and Community Among Medieval Women Visionaries." She is a lecturer still, as it says here, in the University of New Mexico History Department and Religious Studies Department since 2011, teaching courses in the history of Christianity and Western religions. Her interests include medieval and early modern Europe, American religion, religious fundamentalism, mystical and visionary experience, new religious movements, and religious entrepreneurship. Dr. Ray has published several articles in refereed journals and contributed chapters in edited volumes in her field of specialty. At present, she is in Lebanon with her husband, Harry, who is a visiting professor at AUB, and she is a visiting professor at our Near East School of Theology in the field of church history. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Donna Ray.
Thank you. How many of you already have some familiarity with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormons? Okay. For you, some of this information might be rather basic, but I want to start with the basics so that we have a shared understanding of the church, its theology, and its history. Since their founding, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as Mormons or Latter-day Saints or LDS, I will use LDS, have been one of the fastest growing religions. They began in 1830 with 6 members, and they now claim 16 million members worldwide, with more than half of those outside of the US. So the LDS Church is of interest in terms of their relative success as a new religious movement, which in academic terms is defined as an alternative or sectarian religious movement that has come on the scene fairly recently in the last 200 years or so. And in fact, the LDS Church is this very year celebrating its bicentennial. Most new religious movements are fairly small and short-lived, and so the LDS Church has beaten the odds as a new religious movement. So those are impressive raw numbers. Percentage-wise, LDS are still a fairly marginal religious group, though both in the U.S. and in the world, making up about 1.6% of the American population and about 0.002% worldwide. And the Latter-day Saints have struggled particularly in the MENA region to survive and grow, despite their strong attachment to this region, which they claim as a spiritual homeland. So in this lecture, I will first explain who the Mormons are, what makes them distinctive, and then I will turn to the situation of the LDS Church in the MENA region and what we might have to learn from them. So, among the endless variety of Christianity already in existence, in 19th century America, there emerged a new group claiming that it was the true restored church and called itself the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which again is the name that they prefer. So first and foremost, Mormons identify as Christian, and any Mormon will tell you that Jesus Christ is at the center of their devotion, belief, and practice, that he is the Son of God, and that he is the Savior of all humanity through the atoning and sacrificial death of Jesus on the cross. You can see the words Jesus Christ prominently displayed on every signboard on ward chapels in the LDS Church. The LDS Church actually made the words Jesus Christ in a larger font beginning in 1995 in order to emphasize their Christian identity. That said, Mormons also depart in significant ways from traditional creedal Christianity, and these differences I will describe as we go along. Just sort of anecdotally, a 2016 Pew Research Center poll was taken while Mitt Romney, who is a member of the LDS Church, was running for U.S. president. And this poll revealed the disconnect between how Mormons see themselves and how others see them. In this poll, only around half of the general American population considered Mormons to be real Christians or legitimate Christians. And here's why. According to the LDS Church, the restoration of the gospel began with their founding prophet, Joseph Smith, based upon his visions and direct communications with God, Jesus, angels, prophets, and apostles. Mormons believe that their church continues to be guided by living prophets and apostles who receive and convey ongoing revelation from God. It's this ongoing revelation that sets them apart, making them, in their view, not merely another Christian denomination among many, but the restoration of the true church based upon the perfected and completed gospel of Jesus Christ, which they alone possess. Joseph Smith grew up in upstate New York. Let me see if I can get the little thing to work. Maybe not. Whoops. Nope. Up here in, you can see Palmyra, New York, Western New York. This was a region so hot with revivalism and new spiritual movements during the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century that it was known as the burnt-over district. So there was a lot of sort of spiritual and religious ferment in Western New York at this time. Joseph Smith received his first vision in 1820, again making this the 200th year of the faith, as this marks the beginnings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. At a mere 14 years of age, Joseph received this vision of God and Jesus Christ, who LDS members understand to be two separate personages, as they say. And in this vision, Joseph received the message that all the existing churches were wrong and had been corrupted since the time of the apostles. Later visitations from an angel called Moroni led him to a nearby hillside where he would find a book of golden plates that had been buried for many centuries, and that the true church would be based upon the message on these golden plates. Latter-day Saints believe that an ancient sacred story was written on these plates in a language called Reformed Egyptian, which they believe to be a hybrid of Egyptian and Hebrew. You can see it on this facsimile in the picture. And Smith proceeded to translate the plates from behind a curtain to a series of scribes, including his wife, Emma, and several of his friends. The Book of Mormon, as the translated book was eventually called, is a narrative account that covers events roughly from 600 BCE to 421 CE. So it covers roughly 1,000 years worth of ancient history. And very briefly, begins in Israel with the man that Latter-day Saints believe to be their ancestor, a man called Lehi, a descendant of Jacob's son Joseph, shortly before the Babylonian exile. At this time, a group of Israelites under the leadership of Lehi migrated from Jerusalem, it's believed, by the church along roughly this route. And from this point, Bountiful took a ship to America. This was, again, several centuries before the birth of Jesus. These migrants and their descendants included prophets who foretold Jesus' ministry in Palestine, and Latter-day Saints believe that Jesus visited these people, thought to be somewhere in Central America, after his resurrection and ascension, to show that these prophecies had been fulfilled and to establish then the church in America. Another anecdotal bit. Last March, some Mormon youth from the Abu Dhabi stake in the United Arab Emirates, as a youth group activity, took a trekking adventure through the Arabian desert in the footsteps they believe to have been similar to those of Lehi and his family. And I have to say, one thing I have always admired about Mormons is their very rigorous youth group activities. We had Mormon friends who would take their youth group to the temple on weekends to do proxy baptisms for the dead, and I thought, we're taking our kids to Disneyland, you know. It's this puts us to shame. Again, according to the Book of Mormon, after the arrival of Lehi and company in America, the descendants of Lehi split into two warring tribes, and it was to these tribes that Jesus appeared, preaching to them and inaugurating the true church, whose story was then written down around 400 CE by a man called Mormon, who, along with his son Moroni, were essentially the last two men standing. After Mormon's death, the plates were then buried by his son Moroni in upstate New York, and then subsequently lost to civilization for the next 1,400 years until they were found and translated by Joseph Smith. Latter-day Saints believe that the Book of Mormon is sacred scripture alongside the Bible. The Bible that Mormons use is essentially the King James Version, but it's an annotated translation with some differences, translated by and issued by Joseph Smith. And then there are two other volumes of scripture called the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. Together, these four books are known as the Quad, and they comprise together the restored and finished gospel according to Latter-day Saints. And I actually, thank you to my Mormon friends who are here, have both a Book of Mormon in English and a Book of Mormon in Arabic, which I will pass around. There's also one in Armenian, but they were out of those. So it's from these three additional books of scripture, in addition to the Bible, that distinctive LDS rituals and beliefs were forged. And it's an interesting combination of old and new, which I think is one of the keys to the success of the LDS Church. On the one hand, Mormons reinstituted ancient biblical rites as they understood them. For instance, the reinstitution of the priesthood, which has two levels, and some temple rituals, but also built on new revelations given over time to Joseph Smith and his successors. Latter-day Saints got a lot of bad press, a lot of ridicule and hostility throughout the 19th century, which is what essentially forced them to move westward, as you saw on the map that I showed before. And the chief critiques, in addition to their unusual and exclusive theological claims, were that, first, Joseph Smith had simply made up or plagiarized material in order to write the Book of Mormon, and that the whole thing was a hoax. And indeed, although some Latter-day Saints would contest this, no non-Mormon historians, archaeologists, geneticists, or linguists have ever definitively proved that the claims made in the Book of Mormon are historically true. Often what Latter-day Saints will say in response to that is what many Christians might say in response to the charge that there's no archaeological evidence that, let's say, Noah's Ark existed. The response to that is, we just haven't found the archaeological evidence yet. Another interesting problem about the Book of Mormon is that if you look at it, those of you who are glancing at it as it passes around, you'll see that it's written in quite magisterial English. It resembles King James Version English. And here's the thing. Joseph Smith had a third-grade education, and if you read his journals, you can see he writes at about the level of an 8-year-old with lots of spelling and grammatical errors, and it's a very rudimentary English. And so the question is, how did someone with a third-grade education write this sort of magisterial book of scripture? And the answer that Latter-day Saints give is that proves that it was spiritually, divinely inspired. That is the only explanation. Others say, there were other explanations at work that he plagiarized from existing works and so forth. But this is an issue that has never sort of satisfactorily been resolved. So that's the first major critique, that Joseph Smith was a con man, essentially. The second critique was that Mormons tended to be secretive, to be insular, to be authoritarian, and as they moved westward, essentially set up small theocracies which were felt to be a threat to their neighbors and led to them being driven out wherever they went. Let's see if here's the map again. So from Palmyra, New York, moved to Kirtland, Ohio, then actually to Independence, Missouri, and then backtracked to Nauvoo, but received particularly brutal treatment in Independence. So they were followed everywhere they went with this kind of negative press. Worst of all for their public image in the 19th century was the fact that early Mormons practiced polygamy, or plural marriage, as they called it. This practice began, as far as we know, in 1843, but it was in fact abolished in 1890 as a condition of Utah becoming a state. It had been in Mexico territory. So it was roughly a 50-year experiment that has long ago ended. But Latter-day Saints have had difficulty shaking this negative image from the 3 points I've just mentioned, even to the present day, although mainstream Mormons haven't practiced polygamy since, for over 100 years, although fundamentalist Mormons do, the FLDS. And mainstream Mormons do not want to be mixed up with the FLDS. Joseph Smith was murdered in Nauvoo, in Illinois in 1844, and so his successor, Brigham Young, took most of the Mormon community, who were more than 60,000 at this point, further west to Utah, where they are still headquartered today. The state of Utah is still about 65% Mormon. The beehive on the state quarter, which you can see there, is a Latter-day Saint symbol. It represents their busy community life. Mormons are the busiest people I know, their tight organization, and their strong work ethic. And then the temple, this is the mother church in Salt Lake City, but Mormons' massive temples dominate the skyline of many cities across America and the world. And I'll show you examples of others in a bit. So here I just want to sum up what is distinctive about Mormons, specifically in contrast to traditional mainstream creedal Christianity. And some of these we've already mentioned. So the 4 books of Scripture. In terms of distinctive theology, and also in terms of their ritual, it's way too complicated to treat in depth here. So I am just going to touch upon some of the main points. Of course, one of the main distinctives of LDS belief is that Jesus came to America and established the true church there. Latter-day Saints also do not accept the Nicene or Chalcedonian definition of the Trinity, but rather understand the 3 personages of the Trinity to be separate entities, is sometimes referred to as the social Trinity, unified in will but distinct in persons. They also reject the doctrine of original sin. Most distinctive about Latter-day Saints is their cosmology and their eschatology. Again, very complicated. to describe briefly, but is encompassed by a doctrine known as the doctrine of eternal progression. And very briefly, Mormons understand human life to begin in a premortal existence in which we as spirit children of God dwell with God until we are chosen or choose to be born into human bodies. Life on earth is meant as a test and a trial in which we grow closer to God, grow closer to the image of God, the intention of God for our lives, and do so through a series of ordinances, which I will explain in a bit. Most distinctive about the Latter-day Saint afterlife is the idea that there are 3 levels of heaven, and only those who are most righteous, who are members of the church and who have fulfilled all of its requirements, will reach the highest level, known as the celestial level. Part of what's required in order to meet the requirements for the celestial kingdom is marriage, which Mormons understand to be eternal and celestial. So one tagline Mormons have used in the past, I don't know if they still do, is families are forever, right? This is sort of a key part of their theology, that that marriages that take place in the temple, they are called sealings because you are sealed to your partner for eternity, that these marriages continue into the afterlife, that and that you continue to in fact procreate in the afterlife. So eternal progression, because the idea is even after death you continue to grow, to develop, to conform to God's will, and to progress ideally towards exaltation or godhood yourself. These theological distinctives really help to explain, I think, the appeal of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a really very optimistic, family and community-oriented theology, offering a path to godhood through eternal progression, provided, of course, that you follow the stipulations and the rules, receive the required ordinations or ordinances or sacred rituals. There's a scene in the Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon, in which it's a scene in hell, right? And Mormons are not allowed to drink coffee, and so it's a scene in which there are dancing coffee cups, right, in hell. And I have a Mormon friend who said that's totally inaccurate, right, obviously, but what she was pointing to was that Mormons actually have a very generous vision of the afterlife, in that very, very few people go to what we would call hell, or what they call the outer darkness. Most people will eventually, after the final judgment, end up in one of the 3 realms of heaven. All right, so all of that explains, or helps to explain the appeal and the large numbers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Of course, if you're American, it makes you feel special that the church puts America right at the center of salvation history. The idea of ongoing revelation, I think, is also another key to the appeal of Latter-day Saints, in that is the idea that God continues to speak to us, right? That God did not stop speaking to us with the Bible, but continues to use prophets, especially those at the top of the church hierarchy, which is all male. Here's the current president of the church, understood to be a prophet, seer, and revelator who conveys God's messages to the faithful. His name is Russell Nelson. Most of the church, though, is operated according to volunteer clergy. Everyone has a calling in the church. Those who function as what we would call parish priests are known as bishops, and they have day jobs. They are not paid for their leadership. But this ongoing revelation, right, it trickles down through the hierarchy of the church, but it originates with the current prophet. Again, there are so many different rituals and worship practices among Latter-day Saints. I can't begin to explain them all here, but we'll try to sum up the basics. Latter-day Saints refer to their required rituals as saving ordinances. These are those that will ensure your path to the celestial realm, the highest level of heaven. Some ordinances are done in the ward chapel, which is the equivalent of the local church building. These include baptism, which is traditionally done at the age of 8, confirmation, which is done immediately after baptism, and then the sacrament, which is a weekly sacrament similar to that in Protestant churches, except that it involves bread and water rather than bread and wine. And then the other ordinance that's done in the ward chapel setting is ordination to priesthood, which is conferred upon all worthy men and boys beginning at the age of 12. The other saving ordinances are done in the temple. These include the endowment ceremony, which is for adults making a fuller commitment to the church, and the sealing ritual that is marriage, or in the case of adopted children, the sealing of children to their parents. So rituals done in both locales. Those temple rituals are absolutely essential for exaltation, that is, again, reaching godhood in the celestial realm. All of those ordinances also can be done by proxy, and that is on behalf of the dead. And this is an activity that consumes a lot of time for many Latter-day Saints. I had a Mormon student who spent sometimes hours a week doing proxy baptisms for the dead. And the point of this is to allow people who have died the chance to reach godhood. It also explains why Mormons are so interested in ancestry and genealogy, right? You want to make sure that your ancestors have all received the proxy ordinances so that they will have the opportunity then to reach exaltation. This family is standing in front of, I think that's the Salt Lake Temple. When Latter-day Saints go to the temple, they wear all white garments. So you see the family wearing the white garments there. Mormons are notorious for their strict moral code, known as the Word of Wisdom. This includes the prohibition of the consumption of alcohol, tobacco, drugs, coffee, and tea, what Joseph Smith called hot drinks, and a category much contested, especially among young Latter-day Saints. It also includes a very conservative moral theology, especially around gender roles and sexuality. And then one more distinctive of Latter-day Saints is the tradition of large families. This isn't so much the case anymore, but in past decades, it was not unusual for Mormon families to have 9, 10, 11 or more children. And of course, Mormons are no longer polygamists, but they still place a high value on large families. And this is for really for theological, soteriological reasons. In the doctrine of eternal progression, remember, you must have a human body in order to progress. And so the goal with having large families is to give those premortal spirits human bodies so that they can then progress eventually to godhood. So the more babies, the better. And then finally, of course, Mormons are famous for their intensive missionary work. And Mormon young men have, for a very long time, been expected to do 2-year missionary terms. More recently, young women may also serve an 18-month mission. And Latter-day Saints have, by far as I know, the largest missionary numbers of any religious organization. Currently, 68,000 missionaries on the field among Latter-day Saints. Today, known by the white shirts, the black badges, and the bicycles, right? That's their MO. As the LDS Church has expanded through missionary work, it has built temples, and there are now more than 150 Mormon temples worldwide, each one with a golden statue of the angel Moroni blowing his trumpet at the top. That's how you can spot a LDS temple. The ultimate goal is to have at least one temple in every country. You'll see, though, that there are no temples in the MENA region, and there are reasons for that, which I will talk about in a bit. So Latter-day Saints who live in the MENA region have to go wherever they have family or have a visa in order to complete the required temple ordinances. The closest ones are in Ukraine and in Rome. I know some Latter-day Saints here go to Frankfurt or Bern. Those are the closest. Unlike most Christian churches, Mormon temples are not open to the general public after they've been consecrated. Only Latter-day Saints in good standing are allowed to enter the temple. They must have a card called the Temple Recommend in order to be admitted. So if you want to see the inside of a Mormon temple, you have to like be strategic and find one that's being opened, and then there's about a period of a month when they'll let non-Mormons take a little tour. Mormon temples are pretty standardized. Most of them look roughly the same. But it's interesting that some worldwide have been designed to reflect the architectural style of the area they're in. Here are just a few examples. But you can see that still there's a golden statue of Moroni with his trumpet there on the top of each one of them. I want to look next at what has kept the Mormon Church relatively marginal, both in the U.S. and worldwide, especially in the MENA region. But then turn to the successes that they have had and what we might learn from that. The Latter-day Saints, of course, aspire to be a universal church based on their claim to be the one true church, and have expended massive effort and money to that end, but remain on the margins of Christianity, both in America and globally. And there are a number of reasons for this. Part of it is, of course, to do with the controversial theology and ritual that we've already discussed. Latter-day Saints also have a controversial history, not just in terms of the polygamy and the theocracy, and the tendency to be highly authoritarian, and Latter-day Saints are certainly not alone in having a racist history, but they're particularly notorious for a policy that up until 1978 prevented people of African descent from joining the priesthood or participating in temple rites, essentially preventing them from reaching exaltation. So again, it was only in 1978 that policy was changed. And temples since then have been built in Africa, but evangelization or proselytization in Africa was understandably slow as a result. The Latter-day Saints Church has been, and again, not unique to them, but has been rife with gender politics, especially in recent decades, especially to do with feminism, the ordination of women, and homosexuality. And these issues have caused a lot of ferment and a lot of controversy. Those of us on the outside, I think, in particular, observe continuing sort of exclusivity and insularity among Latter-day Saints. They tend to stick together. This, of course, is on the grounds that they are exclusively the one true church, and this is, but I will give caveats later. Not true of all Latter-day Saints, but they have a reputation for having a general distrust of diversity. This has often led to an unwillingness to engage with other church bodies and religious groups, and also to accommodate differences in the regions where they work. I think they've improved on this point, which is why I footnote that. A reputation for an intolerance of dissent, of harsh treatment of critics, of heavy-handedness in terms of censorship and excommunication follows the Latter-day Saints wherever they go. This is another issue that's changing somewhat. I think the Latter-day Saints have shifted from doing exclusive door-to-door and open-air proselytizing to doing more one-on-one, and using other methods to bring people into the church, using online question and answer forums and so forth. But the door-to-door proselytizing that they are known for has been off-putting to many people. And then within the church itself are the high demands placed on members, including a required 10% tithe. In America and elsewhere, Mormons are popularly referred to as a cult, not by everyone, but by, well, probably the 50% of Americans who understand them not to be legitimate Christians. Religious studies scholars tend to avoid the word cult, given its negative baggage and its actually uselessness as a historical term. I dislike the word cult myself and would not describe the LDS Church as such. I prefer the term high demand religion, and I think the LDS Church does fit that description. Again, Mormons are the busiest people I know. They are in church almost every day, and all of them have some kind of calling that demands a great deal of time, in addition to the 10% tithe, which is where most of the church's revenue comes from. All right. Turning to the MENA region, because Latter-day Saints claim Middle Eastern origins and believe that their history will culminate in Jerusalem, on the belief and on the condition that the Jews will convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, although it's complicated. They have a strong attachment to the MENA region and especially to Israel, and have poured millions of dollars worth of resources into establishing themselves in the Middle East, beginning in Palestine in the 1860s. But there have been political, cultural, and legal barriers to their growth and many setbacks. And so progress of the church has been uneven and patchy in the MENA region, again, due to a variety of issues. Every MENA country prohibits door-to-door and open-air proselytizing. So because this is Latter-day Saints' signature method of spreading their faith, they have had to find other ways to reach people and to spread their faith. This is, of course, a region of periods of political turmoil, and when there has been political turmoil, for instance, during the Lebanese Civil War, often Latter-day Saints have been encouraged or told to evacuate. I think just a couple of weeks ago, Latter-day Saints in Iraq were encouraged to evacuate due to the assassination of the Iranian military leader. These are congregations that are mostly fairly small and tenuous to begin with, and these regional conflicts can be very destabilizing for these congregations. It's also very difficult to gain new converts in a strongly confessional region, especially a Muslim majority region. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not a formally recognized Christian group in Lebanon, for instance. From what I understand, though, that's partly by choice. Latter-day Saints don't fit neatly into any of the 18 categories of official religions in Lebanon, and do not consider themselves to be Protestant, although that would be the group they most strongly resemble. And then locals, especially in the MENA region, who do convert to LDS are often ostracized by their families and their communities, and so you have to have a certain strength of spirit and independence in order to make that conversion work. And historically, the LDS Church has not been particularly good at indigenization, by which I mean adapting itself to a non-American culture. And again, footnote that because this has, I think, improved recently, but there is within the Latter-day Saints Church a principle called the principle of correlation. And what that means is that everywhere you go in the world, every Mormon church you go to, you will essentially see the same layout. Things will be organized in the same way. You'll see even the same art on the walls, and you'll receive exactly the same lesson in Alabama that you would in England, that you would in Lebanon, right? So everything is correlated so that it's very uniform, and that allows the church to sort of control the message. And again, what that tends to lead to is, right, what's being issued by sort of American headquarters is being then imposed upon, if you will, conveyed to cultures that without necessarily making adjustments to that particular culture. Of course, the Book of Mormon has been translated into Arabic as well as many other languages, so they have been assiduous about translations. And what this tends to do is bring with the LDS Church, right, the sort of whiff of American imperialism, which doesn't always work. And I'll give you an example. Every Mormon church in America has a gym and a basketball court. And so wherever Latter-day Saints go in the world, they think we need a gym and a basketball court, right? Even though, right, that particular country may never have even heard of basketball. But it's a trivial example, but it's right, there are a lot of people in I don't know, the South Pacific now who know how to play basketball, who wouldn't have otherwise had it not been for the Latter-day Saints. All right, so given all these strikes against them, you might wonder, how are there any Mormons at all, especially in the MENA region? But obviously there is something about the Latter-day Saints church that keeps it going and that appeals to many people. And based on just informal interactions that I've had with Mormons here and elsewhere, including one convert from the Maronite church, it seems that, as with all successful new religious movements, LDS theology provides an attractive, exciting, new alternative to more formal and traditional churches. One Maronite convert said, the incense and the ritual, it just didn't speak to me, right? But the LDS church, it speaks to me. Another point of appeal for or maybe connection between the LDS Church and this particular culture is its family-centeredness and its conservative moral theology. One local Latter-day Saint told me that right, people in Beirut or Lebanon are surprised to find a religious group that's so morally conservative, especially on issues of sexuality, and some find that attractive. So all told, according to the church's own numbers, there are about 2,700 Mormons in the MENA region. And in Lebanon, fewer than 200. I think that number has fluctuated considerably, though. I think recently some young people have left, and so those numbers have declined. And with a mix of native and non-native members. In the Gulf region, it's a little bit different because of all the expats. The LDS Church in the Gulf region is almost entirely non-native, so that would be American and European expats. Filipino domestic workers make up a large chunk of those. And converts all over the MENA region tend to be drawn mostly from already Christian groups, so Arab Christians and Armenians, for example. This is a map, and it's actually hard to stay current with LDS congregations known as wards, because they tend to come and go in this region in particular. This was the most recent map I could find. And you can see that Mormon congregations are quite few and far between in the MENA region. I know there is one in Syria. There's a small congregation in Damascus, right? It is not on this particular map. And then some congregations, for reasons of safety, don't want to publicize their presence, so they might not show up on a map. Because these congregations tend to be quite small, meetings usually take place in private homes or borrowed spaces on military bases or corporate compounds or in schools. But accommodations of Latter-day Saints in the MENA region varies from place to place. So some Middle Eastern countries have been more open and accommodating than others. They have formal recognition, for instance, in Jordan and in Kuwait, but still can't proselytize. In Kuwait, they can only invite non-Muslims to church. So every country in the MENA region has its own set of rules about how Latter-day Saints can operate. Here you can see a little nod to Middle Eastern architecture with the dome at the top of this. This is a fairly new stake center. So a stake center is kind of the equivalent of a diocese. And so this one is in Abu Dhabi. The United Arab Emirates has been somewhat more open to Mormons than other Middle Eastern countries. This is I think just this year, a Mormon stake that was recognized in Kuwait, and you can see they have a pretty sizable group there. As I mentioned before, in Lebanon, Mormons are not recognized as a legitimate Christian church. Same goes with other sectarian groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, but they are not prevented from meeting. And Latter-day Saints in Beirut meet in this building here on the second floor. Have a nice little setup there that they rent. And Beirut is in fact the district hub for Latter-day Saints in this immediate region that includes Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. This, however, is really the crown jewel of Latter-day Saint presence in the Middle East, and the most notable LDS institution in the region, and that is the Brigham Young University Jerusalem Center for Near Eastern Studies, opened in 1988, but only after they overcame some fairly strong opposition, especially from Orthodox Jews. The school itself is open only to Brigham Young University students, but it is also intended to be sort of a regional meeting place where people of all different faiths can come together. Latter-day Saints take pride in the fact that they don't take sides on the Israel-Palestine issue, but they consider all to be the children of Abraham, and have done some interfaith work on those grounds. They are, again, here not allowed to proselytize, although other Christian groups can proselytize in Israel. But again, this is a place that has eschatological importance to them in that Latter-day Saints believe that the end times, which are expected to be soon, hence their name, we are living in the latter days, will involve the ingathering of Israel. And so Latter-day Saints believe and hope that they will build a temple in Jerusalem, although they have been prevented from doing so, and will be allowed to do missionary work among Jews to prepare the way for Christ's return. Globally, Mormon growth has leveled off in the last 20 years, and many Latter-day Saints, again, especially younger ones in this region, are leaving. But despite their many challenges and their continued marginal status, to the degree that they have gained ground and won converts, Latter-day Saints have had to make some adjustments to their environment and have done so in a variety of ways. This isn't really an adjustment, but more of a state of mind. What's always astonishing to me is Latter-day Saints' incredible self-belief as the one true church, and in their end-time prophecies that, as we speak, are being fulfilled in this region. These are very powerful and motivating beliefs. Despite any current evidence to the contrary, the church believes that it is making progress towards its latter-day vision. And again, this is due to, I think, as an outsider, a very strong sense of, it's almost a sense of ownership of this region, along with a claim to genetic connection, although Mormons would say we're not all literally genetically connected to the Israelites, but we have that ancestral connection through the prophet Lehi who came over, right? So it's a spiritual connection. It's a sort of cosmic connection. It's a genetic connection, and this strong sense of identity outweighs practical and political realities. And then, of course, the missionary spirit and the missionary effort that grows out of that self-belief. And then, right, getting real, the LDS Church pours lots of money into this region that helps it stay afloat and promote its ministries. And then there have been some cultural adjustments, and here is the footnote that I mentioned earlier in terms of the ways that Latter-day Saints have found themselves right in a position of needing to tweak their tendency to not make cultural adjustments, but they have. So depending on the congregation, they might speak Arabic, English, French, or other languages. In the Beirut congregation, which I visited a couple of weeks ago, it was very interesting. People could speak in either English or Arabic, depending on what was most comfortable for them, and Rula would translate. So that was a good way to handle the bilingual worship service. In some countries, in the MENA region in particular, LDS have been flexible about the day they meet to worship. Of course, it's always been traditionally on a Sunday morning, but in Muslim majority countries, some LDS churches will worship on Fridays in order to fit in with the culture there, and on Saturdays in Israel. And then architectural features like that dome on the Abu Dhabi Stake Center that I showed you earlier. Latter-day Saints have also been and have had to be creative in getting around the prohibition on proselytizing, and have been very effective in reaching out to others through individual contact, on social media and the internet, in some cases through offering free English classes, job search classes, small business development classes, a variety of ways to reach out to people and develop more one-on-one relationships. And then I think most significantly is the church's humanitarian work through its LDS charities. And in its humanitarian work is where Latter-day Saints really tend to work cooperatively with other Christian and faith groups. So that's been a good development all around in terms of reaching out to the general community and also to other faith communities. So they and other diminishingly small Christian or other religious groups, in my opinion, will need to keep up all of that in order to survive, especially in terms of greater indigenization, openness to diversity, and interfaith cooperation, and emphasis on humanitarian work. The future of LDS members in this region remains to be seen. They will probably, like many other small Christian groups, remain on the margins given both internal and external limitations placed upon them. But in my experience, Mormons are very persistent. They have very strong faith, and they have a remarkable capacity for reinvention, depending on their circumstances. And this is thanks to, again, right, the doctrine of ongoing revelation. A new word or directive from God may be conveyed to them at any moment. Lastly, I will just say that whatever we may make of their history and their theology, it's remarkable how much good Latter-day Saints have done both in this region and worldwide, despite their small numbers. One thing I always remember is that during Hurricane Katrina, which I think was in 2005, and the news coverage of that, Mormons were the first people on the ground to help with the humanitarian work, and that is very often the case. Here I've just included some pictures of LDS charities in this region in Jordan and Lebanon. So certainly the Mormons I have met, both here and elsewhere, are wholeheartedly devoted to reaching out to refugees and other needy populations and contributing to the common good. So even tiny minority religions can make a difference. And with that, I will stop and take questions.
Thank you very much. We do have some time for questions. Keep them short. Yes.
the personal revelations received by Joseph Smith and a few from Brigham Young are recorded. Beyond that, there are very few. So very few revelations received by the church's prophets that were felt to merit inclusion in the Doctrine and Covenants. I think the racial change in 1978 is in there, and that is the most recent one. So there's actually, I'm not quite sure how to answer the question. Do you mean like do they contradict each other? Yeah. Well, sometimes, I mean, in the sense that they had a racial policy that flipped, right? But that, I think that Latter-day Saints would say, well, that's, you know, God has made a new decision, and it's, I guess that can be seen as a benefit, right? That God can change his mind. I don't think they would put it that way, but that new developments can take place. But yeah, I mean, new revelation is necessarily going to overturn something earlier. So that's why it's a difficult one.
The Christianity of LDS is very strange. You said it is complicated, but it is hardly Christianity as we know it, because in a part of it, it is paganism, with a God who is married, and a part of it, it is not even theistic, because God himself, as they say, was a man, and he became God.
Yeah.
So it is not monotheism. Okay, so it's not monotheism. It is not Christianity as we know it. It is a new kind of Christianity, and it is very close to paganism in many ways.
Oh well, those are certainly critiques that are made. I'll take the monotheism one first. Yes. So if we all have potential for godhood, that means that potentially there are millions and billions of gods rather than one God. And yes, Mormons do believe that Jesus, or that God the Father and God, there is a heavenly mother as well, are human beings with flesh and blood. They're exalted human beings, but they're still human beings, right? And that the goal, right, the ultimate goal for a Latter-day Saint is to reach godhood yourself, right? Potentially creating multiple gods. But Latter-day Saints that I've spoken to have said, well, we can reach godhood, but it's not quite on the level. It's not quite on the level of Heavenly Father, right? And so, because there's a sort of hierarchy of godhood, there's still one supreme God. It doesn't quite wash logically, I agree, but that's the argument that I have heard. And any Latter-day Saints in the room who want to add something, please do. Yes.
I'd like to answer the first question about continual revelation.
Yeah.
Every 6 months we have a general conference of the church, and the prophet addresses us.
Yeah.
And also we regard his words every 6 months as revelation.
Right.
Okay? It's not officially written in the book of Scripture, but it's available online, and it's available for all the members and non-members. But every 6 months, we have a general conference, and the prophet addresses the members.
Yeah.
Dr. Alwad.
Thank you, Professor Ray. This was educational for me. Where, according to Mormons, where did the church get it wrong? Where did the church get things wrong?
Yeah.
Particularly soteriologically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe someone, I know when it happened, and that was with the death of the apostles. That the way they put it is that the priesthood authority was lost at that point. I'm not entirely sure why, although it has to do with the introduction of Platonic philosophy and non-Christian elements and developments that took the church further and further away from its early church apostolic roots. The soteriological question is a good one. The loss of priesthood authority then made all Christian rituals and beliefs null and void, essentially, until it was restored by Jesus' MENA. But that's not to say that there haven't been good and faithful Christians over the centuries. I think charitable Latter-day Saints would say those people will still make it to the terrestrial realm, which is the middle level of heaven. So they're not saying that they were all terrible people and didn't have any of the truth. They just didn't have the completed restored.
And has there been dialogues with the Christian church at humanitarian meetings?
Some,
missions?
yeah, especially in the U.S. Yeah, there have been some efforts in recent years to bring evangelicals, for instance, and Latter-day Saints together to find some common ground.
Dr. Ford?
You briefly mentioned this fundamentalist LDS.
Yeah.
Would this represent a typical breakaway of a group that was not happy with changes that were developing within the group?
Yeah, it's interesting. There have been many LDS splinter groups over the last 200 years, but two in particular that have been the largest and most successful. And so you've got your mainstream Mormons, who are the great majority, and then the FLDS splintered off when, in 1890, the Mormon Church had to renounce polygamy for the sake of statehood, right? So at that point, the FLDS said, no, we still believe that is God's will, along with other teachings that were sort of abandoned by mainstream Mormons, and so they consider themselves actually to be the true heirs of original Mormonism and hanging on to the polygamy as a part of that. And then the other splinter group is the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which now calls itself the Community of Christ. And they are more liberal. So you've got the sort of the ultra fundamentalist splinter group, and then you've got the more liberal splinter group. And the Community of Christ, for instance, allows women to be bishops, so local church leaders. They're not as strict about the ordinances. They're closer to a Protestant church. If you look at their website, they have a Q&A, and then one of the questions is, do you use the Book of Mormon, or what are your books of scripture? And they have this long paragraph about how they're Bible-based, and then a little sentence at the end, and we also use the Book of Mormon, right? So it's really kind of downplay their Mormon roots in a way. Yeah.
Any more? Yes.
My name is Richard Nyman. I'm from Canada, and I love my wife. We're 75 to 76 years old. We volunteer our time to do humanitarian efforts. We've been here before, a couple of years, 2006 to 2008, and we've been here now for about 15 months now. And we love being here. The people are wonderful. And I just want to say one thing. When Christ comes, we're all going to be here. I don't think any one of you are with it. You're wonderful people. You're interested in serving the Lord. We're all going to be on earth the going to be our leader. Jesus Christ. He's going to be our leader. So get used to seeing my face. I'm going to get used to seeing yours. I really believe that. It's a beautiful thought.
Thank you. If there are no more, I have one by Ryan and Dr. Awad, and that's it. Anybody else? Okay, last two questions.
Since marriage is so highly seen as a seal, what about their stance with civil marriage and civil law on marriage, and is there divorce?
Yes, but it's strongly discouraged. The real complication comes in where if you've had more than one spouse, which spouse will you be sealed to eternally? You get into complications with that. What if you have an abusive spouse? Will you be forced to be sealed to that person for eternity? What if one spouse is an approved, right, super righteous, church-going, done all the requirements, Latter-day Saint, and has made it to the celestial realm, but the other one was kind of mad, right, and only made it to the terrestrial realm. How are they going to be sealed for eternity if they're not in the same realm of heaven? And I have asked these questions so many times to so many different Mormons, and I get a somewhat different answer every time. So one of my students asked if there was level jumping, right? Like if you're in the terrestrial realm, is there any possibility that you could make it to the celestial realm? And I have been told no. That's it. That's the final judgment.
Do the four sources of teaching have the same authority? I mean, does the Bible,
Four books.
for the books, yes, for the four books of, does the Bible have a higher authority?
Yeah, I think that's shifted a bit over time. The
That'd be
Book of
nice.
Mormon has always been considered, I think,
The most authoritative.
the most authoritative,
I see.
with the Bible second, and then the Doctrine and Covenants, and then the Pearl of Great
okay.
Price. The Pearl of Great Price is kind of a miscellany. It's kind of a catch-all for sort of Mormon documents that didn't fit neatly into the other three. I think in more recent years, the church has tried to balance more a bit the Bible and the Book of Mormon. So the youth, again, with the rigorous youth programs, right? Mormon youth have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning for 4 years, so all during high school, basically, to go to what's called seminary, which is, I don't know, an hour of church lessons before they go off to school. And they focus on a different book of scripture each of those 4 years. But I think it's Old Testament, New Testament, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants. They don't cover the Pearl of Great Price. So they're trying to give, I think they've been in recent years trying to give more equal attention to the Bible and to the Book of Mormon.
The last, very last question, Marina. Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask for the original source of the Book of Mormon. Is it known where it is today?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, so Joseph Smith had to give the golden plates back to the angel Moroni, so they are no longer available to be seen. But in the, if you look in the opening pages of the Book of Mormon, 11 people claim to have seen the golden plates, and there's sort of sworn held in it. But that's all the proof we have that the golden plates actually existed.
So the picture is
The picture is a facsimile, that's correct, yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming, and thank you.